A little bit of oomph, a little bit of oomph, little bit of oomph, little, big finish, little bit of oomph. Amazing.
Woo!
I'm not bringing my guitar anymore. It's so much easier.
This is the Book of Life. I'm Heidi Rabinowitz. At the 2019 Association of Jewish Libraries Conference in Los Angeles, California, we recorded a Book of Life live show. My guests were Joni Sussman of Carbon Publishing and author, illustrator, and musician Barney Salzberg. We discussed picture book illustration while recording our conversation in front of a live audience of Judaica librarians. Here it is, our first ever live show. This is the Book of Life. I'm Heidi Rabinowitz. Hello, Los Angeles. It is so exciting to see you here. This is not only a podcast, it's a session at the Association of Jewish Libraries' 54th Annual Conference. We'll start with a little history about the show, and then we will interview our two special guests, Joni Sussman and Barney Salzberg. And Barney will also be leading us in song a little bit later. So a little history. Back in 2005, I finished my term on AJL's Sidney Taylor Book Award Committee, and I was ready for a new project because I'd been so busy it was hard to slow down. And I was all fired up about promoting Jewish books to a wide audience because that was part of the mission of Sidney Taylor. So I saw a snippet in School Library Journal, the magazine, about librarians doing podcasts, and it was a brand new thing at the time that hardly anybody had ever heard of. So I went to the URL that they mentioned, and I listened to the audio, and it was very rough, and I thought, I could do that. So the first episode was published of the Book of Life in December 2005. And my original idea for the podcast was to promote the books within my own library to my congregation. I'm a temple librarian at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida, a large Reform synagogue. And I thought I will interview the readers, I will talk to the rabbi and the teachers and the director of the preschool and the children, and I'll ask them about the books they like to read, and then they'll hear what their friends are reading and they'll come in and borrow it. So I had a sort of local idea about how it was going to go. And then I found out that if I stuck a microphone in the face of any of these people, they would freeze up. They were scared to talk to me. They all got stage fright. And so I thought, well, I've been to AJL a few times and I've met many authors and maybe they'll talk to me. So I started calling up authors for interviews and they were thrilled because they needed publicity and they loved to talk about their work. So it became a kind of fresh air format to talk with authors and illustrators, publishers, musicians, independent filmmakers, webmasters about the Jewish projects that they were creating. So it's the backstory of the materials that are in a library like mine. I'd like to ask, how many of you listen to the podcast To the Book of Life? Thank you. And how many of you are subscribed to the Book of Life? Okay, so I just want to make sure you understand that you can subscribe to a podcast, and that way it will automatically appear in whatever app it is that you're using to access that audio. You'll automatically get new episodes downloaded. So subscribing is very helpful for shows where you're a fan. And if you're not already subscribed, you can find out how to subscribe for your particular device by going to the Listen tab at bookoflifepodcast.com up near the top. Also, I wanted to mention, if you use Facebook or Twitter, please like or follow the Book of Life on social media. So we're going to move on to our interview now, and we have two wonderful guests. We have Joni Sussman and we have Barney Salzberg, and I'd like to ask each of you to do just like a couple sentences introduction of yourself.
So I'm Joni Sussman. I'm the publisher at Carbon Publishing, and we are the Jewish children's book imprint of Lerner Publishing Group. We do about 25 titles a year, so we are a large children's book publisher.
I'm Barney Salzberg. I'm an author and an illustrator. I'm also a singer and a songwriter, mostly children's music. My first book came out in 1981 when dinosaurs walked the earth. And I've done close to 50 books, which I've written and illustrated. A few books have been illustrated by other people. I've illustrated 1 or 2 books from some other authors, but primarily I write and illustrate my own work.
Thank you. Let's start with Barney. Barney, tell us about your illustration technique.
Well, that's an interesting question. It's changing. Currently, most of the work I'm doing is digital. In spite of the name Barney, I didn't want to become a dinosaur. And I kind of took to digital art early on. I did a book, I don't even remember what year it came out. It's a long time ago, called Animal Kisses. I was kissing my children goodnight as different animals and thought it was a good title. And I drew a book on the computer and literally sent it to my publisher on a CD. They didn't know what to do with it. And I've come a long way to having a Cintiq monitor, which I draw with a stylus like I do on my iPad. And I do digital watercoloring, and it looks like it's on watercolor paper. And I find that it's a much more forgiving medium as far as being able to draw something over and over and over again. And my line work is on one layer, and my colors are on another. And if I need to change things, I can without starting from scratch. It feels a little strange from time to time because it isn't traditional paper anymore, but I find that it's pretty amazing to work with, and I'm sometimes combining photographs and textures that I take pictures of and sticking them into my artwork, and it's a new technique for me, but it's evolving every time I use it.
Cool. How is your personality reflected in your work?
Well, definitely my sense of humor is in my books. My wife says I look like all my characters, which a lot of dogs, anything with a large nose. I think my sense of humor, I think my values are in my books, for sure. I mean, they're my stories. It's funny, when I started, my wife's a lawyer. I said we made a complete brain when we got married. She used to talk about messages and stories, and I always felt like initially when I started writing books, I didn't want messages. I wanted to entertain. And as I've gotten older and raised 2 kids of my own and spoken all over the world, I do find a need to impart some messages now. I think that my values for helping one another and being a good person is something that is important to me to model in my stories. If they start getting the sense that you're teaching it, you lose the game. But if you can do that through a sense of humor and whimsy and still plant a seed, that's sort of what I strive for in my stories now. It's what I strive for in my life, and they're kind of mushed together.
Okay. I have one more question for you before we start talking with Joni. You've talked before about illuminating versus illustrating a text. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, this is a concept that I was given this beautiful book that Abrams put out called The Art of Maurice Sendak. I have an autographed copy of that book. If there was a fire, that would be what I grab to leave the house with. And there's a particular chapter on the art of a picture book, and he talks about the concept of illuminating. And the example I give is I did a book many years ago about a neighbor I had in Los Angeles. Every time my ball rolled onto her lawn, she took it. She was lovely. So I wrote a story called Mrs. Morgan's Lawn. And in the book dummy, where I submitted the story to my editor, there was a line in the book that said, somewhere inside of her house must be a closet full of balls. What could she do with all of them? And the picture I drew for my dummy was a little thought balloon of a closet full of balls over the boy's head. And my editor said, this is a boring picture. Part of the sentence that said, what could she do with all of them, was where they wanted me to focus. I went back and rethought the picture. So to illuminate, that was an illustration. I illustrated that text literally, closet full of balls. I ended up drawing Mrs. Morgan as a witch, reading a book that says great ball recipes, and cooking the balls in a cauldron. The text didn't change. It still said, somewhere inside of her house must be a closet full of balls. What could she do with all of them? That's illuminating the text. It's what can you bring to the story that isn't necessarily in it. Another quick example, a woman who called me to ask me how to write children's books, Peggy Rathman, who wrote Officer Buckle and Gloria and got the Caldecott, in her book Goodnight Gorilla, which I have the original dummy, there is no mouse or a balloon or a banana in it. She snuck those into the story without telling her editor, and that's the thing you look at when you read the book, and they're never mentioned. So that's sort of illuminating, but it's also really just adding some soul to a story and giving you something else to look at rather than just listening to the story.
Okay, thank you.
If that makes sense.
Thank you. So, Joni, as a publisher, explain to us what an art profile is and why that's important in the creation of a picture book.
So, unlike what Barney does, which is both the text and the art, usually we're coming at it from another point of view, where first we get the manuscript, and then we start to think about what's the vision for this book? What will it look like? What did the author have in mind? What does the editor think? What kind of characters will we use? Is this a book that would be suitable to being illustrated with animal characters? Should we use people characters? Is it a time travel book? What's going on in this story? And we create an art profile that helps us decide what kind of an illustrator we are going to have for this book.
Is it possible to make a book without an art profile?
You know, we usually don't. The only time is, again, when we have an author-illustrator. Part of it is that because we're publishing multiple books in a season, we want to make sure that we have a variety of different kinds of books with different kinds of illustrations. We don't want all of our books to look the same. So we do put together a profile of some kind that will sort of help us target how we want this book to look. And sometimes it's a matter of, are these going to be animals representing the children so that every kid, no matter whether it's a boy or a girl, black, white, any kind of ethnic background or age, if it's an animal, every kid can see themselves in this story? Might that be an approach? Or are we going to have some animals, like what Barney was saying about illuminating a manuscript where the characters don't actually appear in the text at all, but they're in the imagination of the illustrator? And so sometimes we make a note to the illustrator about that, but sometimes we just leave it to the illustrator's imagination and we come up with really wonderful characterizations.
So how is an art profile created? Do you create it entirely on the publishing side? Is there input from the author or the illustrator?
It's created on the publishing side, but we share what we have in mind with the author so that they can weigh in. So if I will usually pick 3 illustrators maybe that we think might be suitable, and then we do have the author weigh in so that they can let us know what they might be thinking about this. Do they like one illustrator more than another? Is this what is envisioned? Having said that, we don't rely entirely on the author, because sometimes the author will say, well, you know, this little girl should have red hair because my daughter is 7 and she has red hair. Well, that's not necessarily a consideration for us. In fact, if we don't have a redheaded kid in that season and we might want to include it, that's fine. But we only take those things into account. We don't necessarily have the author dictating what the illustration should be like, but we certainly want their buy-in and we want them to love their book, because in the end, of course, it is their book.
Barney, from an illustrator's point of view, how does this kind of art profile from a publisher help you or hinder you?
Yes. It's funny. I'm seeing it more now than I ever have. I've had, in the last 5 years, 2 editors say, would you be okay with someone else's art? And I always say, my ego's not that big. Let me see what you're thinking. Because I want the art to represent the best look the story can have. And if it's my drawings, that would be great. If someone else can do a better job, I'm open to it. Some houses now, unlike what you're talking about at your house, want a look. And it kind of bothers me because I get it. I mean, these are books you find at the Pottery Barn. There's a look. But I feel like the drawings, the paintings, the illustrations for a book should be the best ones to pull that story together, and not the look of a house. And I'm seeing some publishers are now looking for an overall look, and you can tell that this book came from them. Usually authors aren't asked to look at the illustrations. I did one book with Laura Numeroff where someone else illustrated it, and they just sent us a finished book. It was completely a surprise to us. Again, this was a while ago, maybe it's changed, but I was shown 2 different artists for a book you have here, Hug This Book, and I picked this guy, and he didn't speak a word of English. It was really interesting. And they translated the book, and he was open to having me alter a few little pages, and we worked beautifully together. And it was kind of fun to see another person's approach to my own story, nothing I would have come up with myself.
Mm-hmm. So. Okay. Barney, you are really well known for this book that we have right here, Beautiful Oops, which is about turning a supposed mistake into an opportunity for beautiful art. And this book was even adapted into a musical. how does that kind of freewheeling serendipity fit in with the needs of a publisher like Joni's been talking about?
Well, I think it depends on the publisher. I mean, particularly Workman, who did this book, was one of the only houses that could do it because it's a really labor-intensive, hand-built book. Not everyone can handle that. They also don't take on a book unless they feel like they can sell 100,000 copies, which most publishers don't go there. It would be lovely if we did. My editor for that was Raquel, who wrote Wonder. And she saw this book and bought it immediately. She had the sensibility for it. Some editors didn't get it. My agent at the time was a little curious about it, didn't know if it was something that would sell. And to have an intuitive editor who didn't have to go in front of a whole group of people to get permission, she bought it when I sent it to her immediately. So it really just takes a specific publisher. It's not everyone's cup of tea.
Okay. Joni, how have art profiles changed in response to changing ideas within publishing? And I'm thinking in particular of the growing emphasis on showing diverse characters and also the own voices movement.
So I would get away from the idea of the art profile when you're talking about something like this, because if you're asking, has illustration changed in recent times, it definitely has. And part of it is that even though the stories have remained, I wouldn't say the same, but many of the same kinds of themes, the illustrations have changed a lot. And there's a couple of reasons for that. With digital artwork now available, we have access to illustrators all over the world, and we didn't used to be able to do that. It used to be domestic illustrators who would draw on boards and, send them to us via FedEx for scanning. And now I have illustrators all over the world. So the sensibilities of illustrators from Italy and South Africa and Israel and all over the world, that makes a big difference in terms of the different kinds of illustration we see. The other thing is that we try to include in our illustrations things that aren't necessarily included in the story. For example, we can include, if we have a classroom scene, kids of all different colors, kids in a wheelchair, families of all different kinds. When you do a book about a Seder, it doesn't necessarily talk about who the guests were at the Seder, but you can portray all different kinds of guests at the Seder. It can be two dads with a baby, it can be people of different ethnic backgrounds, and all of that is conveyed in the illustrations. And that has made an enormous difference. I think that's a big, big change in children's books, and especially in Jewish children's books, because we always figured that American Jews were white Ashkenazi Jews, and now there's a much greater effort to portray a larger, broader Jewish community, Sephardic communities, Jews of color, and all different kinds of family configurations as well. And all of that really rests in the illustrator's lap, because we don't want our books to be didactic, but the illustrations really are the partners in telling these stories. So I do think that has changed a lot in the last even half a dozen years.
Okay. You've talked a little bit about using animal characters. So what are the advantages or disadvantages of using animal characters?
Well,
and also I wanted to ask you, can you talk about how you decide whether to include realistic animals versus anthropomorphic animals, whether to mix animals with humans, like some of the different variations?
So we have a number of different kinds of books that show different things. So for instance, our Sammy Spider series that many of you are familiar with, here we've got a real family, right? The Shapiros with the little boy, but the spider is an anthropomorphic spider, right? He talks, he climbs, he goes around and does things, and that is a really lovely way to appeal to kids. So some of our stories, we're going to take an approach like that, where there are some human characters behaving like humans and some animals also behaving like humans, but the animals and the humans aren't interacting. In other words, the little boy doesn't hear the talking spider. It's the spider that's doing his thing. Then there are other ones that take place entirely in an animal universe. So for instance, we have a book called Where's the Potty on This Ark? And in this book, the animals are on Noah's Ark. This is a famous midrash that when God told Noah to build the ark, he took care of everything. Places to eat, places to poop, everything was contained in the ark. And so this is a riff by Carrie Olitsky, who's a rabbi, who writes about what it would be like for the animals having to poop on the ark. How did they do that? And of course, it's a potty training book for little kids in the guise of being potties on the ark. And these are all the animals who do talk, and the birds do fly, but they also talk and they ask questions. So that's a universe of entirely anthropomorphic animals. And then we also have some that are real animals, where it's animals behaving just as animals do. So it's a realistic story of some kind, where a cat behaves like a cat and is not talking or doing anything unusual. So there are different approaches to this, and when I read a manuscript, I think about, is this a book where we should or should not be including animals? Animals are really popular. And even if we do a book that's entirely involving humans, there's usually a kitty in the room, there's a mouse poking out of a hole, there's something that can attract a small child, even if that animal character has nothing at all to do with the story. So we take all of those things into account, and we know that kids love animals, and that makes even some difficult topics accessible.
So can you give us some examples, Joni, of art profiles for specific titles, maybe some of these books that you've brought with you?
Yes. So I'm holding up a book called Raisins and Almonds, which is a really beautiful dreamlike story that's a takeoff on the Yiddish lullaby Rozenkes mit Mandlin. And in this story, a little girl dreams about a goat that's under her bed that's selling raisins and almonds. It's really an unusual and lovely kind of art. Oh, and Barney is reminding me, as he should, who's the artist? And this was illustrated by Sonia Sanchez. The author was Susan Tarkov. So thank you, Barney. You're absolutely right. Here's a beautiful book called Yuvi's Candy Tree. This is by Leslie Simpson, illustrated by Janice Lee Porter. And Janice is an illustrator of color, so we really thought that that would be especially nice for a story that has to do with an Ethiopian child. And the premise of this story is that the little girl and her grandmother are making the trek across Africa, coming to Israel, and the grandmother tells her that angels will come on white wings and take them to Israel, and there will be candy trees. After really a quite grueling story, when they come to where the El Al airplanes, they are big white birds, these wings, and when she comes to Israel, she finds orange trees, and they've never had oranges, and she picks the oranges, and those become the candy trees. This is a beautiful story. It's based on the true story of an Ethiopian woman who has come to Israel, and this is actually her story. And this is a nice example of reality. We wanted somebody who really looks like an Ethiopian child. She's riding a donkey because, in fact, that's how they made their trek. So here we have both humans and animals, but it's definitely a human story, and it's the true story of this child. I have a couple of other things, if I can just show them, Heidi, that's a little bit off the topic, but one of the things that Heidi and I discussed was when you have a profile for a book, what happens if you change the covers? We do have a couple of books that we've re-illustrated, and I thought I would show them to you, and again, I know it's a podcast, so I will attempt to describe. I'm holding up the original version of a book called The Mouse in the Matzah Factory. And those of you who are really old like me will remember that this book was printed in brown ink on cream-colored paper, and the front cover looks like a piece of matzah. After a while, this book had been in print for a really long time, and we loved the story, but really the look of it was dated. Having said that, many people have said, why did you change that book? I love that. But we changed it, and I'm now holding up the newer version, which is already maybe 8 years old. David Goldstein illustrated the original one. The new illustrator is Nicole Indenbosch. And so this one was redone as a full 4-color book, and it's sold as if it was a new book in the marketplace, and it made an enormous difference. So I think it's kind of fun to see the old cover and the new, and I brought one more example of a book. This is the original, The Passover Parrot. I see some people are nodding in the audience here. The author is Evelyn Zussman, and it was illustrated by Catherine Janice Kahn. It was lovely art for its day, but it really looked like a dated book. And so we re-illustrated it just last year. Kristen Brooker did the illustration, and it's beautiful. It got great reviews, and again, it's selling as if it were a new book. The illustrations have made an enormous difference. So even though it's the very same story, some of these books are so wonderful that if they're older and we want to give them new life, we can re-illustrate.
Thank you. I was going to ask you about updating art profiles, so you beat me to it. Barney, I wanted to talk about your work is, for the most part, not specifically Jewish, but we were talking about Tea with Grandpa and how it became more Jewish than it was to begin with. Can you tell us about that?
Well, the lovely people at PJ Library came to Neil Porter, who was my editor on that book, and asked if they could reprint the book in paperback on the condition that they changed the title to Tea with Zadie. It was a no-brainer. I was honored. And what I realized, having spent a week with the PJ Library people, I was with 20 authors and went to Israel a few months back, which was an amazing trip of a lifetime, was that this sort of fell into the category of Jewish values as opposed to a book that had a specific tale dealing with a holiday or something like that. So that felt more like, from my wheelhouse, that's something that I would be able to do. And I'm thinking about coming here and things we'd be talking about. I was kind of going over some of the books I've written, and a book that I did years ago called Crazy Hair Day, which was about a Jewish hamster named Stanley Birdbaum. Again, it's not a Jewish story, but the sensibilities in that story was inspired by taking my son to school one morning, and there was a kid who showed up with spikes in his hair, and everybody looked at him and said, Crazy Hair Day's tomorrow. And he looked like he was going to die, and he turned and ran. I thought, is there a story here? And I just read a book about a boy who had lost their hair from chemo, and how he didn't want to come to school. And when he finally ultimately came, his friends had shaved their heads to welcome him back. And I thought, if I could weave that into my story, it's not a book about cancer, but it's a book about solidarity and anti-bullying, concept, where we embrace someone who's having a troubled time. And I think that falls into a book that would be something that a Jewish library would probably welcome.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Joni, tell us about a beautiful oops, meaning a serendipitous mistake that happened in the creation of a Kar-Ben book.
Well, I'm not sure that I have a beautiful oops. Usually when there's an oops, it's an oops, and it's not beautiful. But we have had some oopses that have become teachable moments. So, for instance, we did one book called Talia and the Very Yom Kippur. And this is a little series of 3 books where the kid Talia mishears Hebrew words, and here the story is that it's Yom Kippur. If it's Yom Kippur, why are people fasting? Break the fast. Does that mean they're having breakfast? Why aren't they eating if it's breakfast? And it's a very cute story, and we had a non-Jewish illustrator. The research on our end for a non-Jewish illustrator is enormous, and in this case, I missed something. So the art comes in, it's beautiful, it's perfect, and I'm looking for anything obvious, that wouldn't be there on Yom Kippur, that they're not doing things they shouldn't do on Yom Kippur. I'm always crazed that something's going to happen. And in one scene, there's a coffee cup on the table. And I thought, oh my God, and the book's already gone to print, and there's a coffee cup, and it's Yom Kippur. And a reviewer actually called and said, there's a coffee cup, a Jewish reviewer, there's a coffee cup, and it's Yom Kippur. And I said, well, it's the grandma's coffee cup, and she's taking medicine. So we came up with a whole thing that we had on our website about what are some exceptions to Yom Kippur. If you're younger than Bar Mitzvah, you don't need to fast. If you're older and need to take medicine, that's acceptable. So I wouldn't say that's a beautiful oops, and when we reprinted, we took the cup out, but for that first round, we had it there. But we watch very carefully for oopses, which, in the Jewish children's books, they're fraught. The Hanukkah candles in the menorah. If you want to poke your eye out with a stick, try to explain to somebody how we light the candles. They go in from right to left, and they're lit from left to right. Whenever I can, I have all the candles lit in every scene. It's not always possible to do that, but the chance of making an error is enormous. Same thing with the letters on the dreidel. They have to be there in a certain order, and it's so easy to miss something like that. We really do, I think, a very good job of catching that. And one of the things that we caught was I had an Italian illustrator that was illustrating a Sukkot book. She had to draw a lulav and an etrog, and I knew she wasn't going to know what those were, so I sent her research photos. This is what they look like. Fortunately, we do sketches before we do final art. When the sketches came back, the lulavs were sitting in pots like cactuses. And, it didn't occur to me to show her how the lulav is held and what you do with it. So there are all these things that one needs to keep in mind when you're giving art direction. It's not so much that we want to tie their hands, obviously, but we want to make sure that especially when they're doing Jewish ritual items. On the one hand, it's lovely to have this whole wide world of people who can illustrate people in different countries, Jews, non-Jews, but you really have to be careful with the details. That's a lot of work. But usually it goes very well. And a lot of the illustrators comment afterwards that it's been an interesting project for them because they've learned something that they didn't really know.
Those are good stories. So I want to ask both of you sort of parallel questions. I wanted to ask Joni, what message do you have for illustrators in general? And Barney, what message do you have for publishers in general?
Well, when I send out art direction to an illustrator, so my process is we look at several illustrators, we pick the one that we want, and then we send them a storyboard, which basically says this is the size of the book, this is the text. You can feel free to move the text around on the page, but basically this is what we're thinking for the page breaks. I send photo references if there are Jewish things that they might not know about, or if there are specific things that need to be drawn out. And then really, we want them to go wild. You know, we're doing a sketch phase, and so we will have the chance to rein in anything that might be too out there or not work. But, you know, we're hiring illustrators because we want their wonderful imaginations. Barney made a very good point when he was talking about illuminating. One of the biggest challenges is to decide how much does the illustration have to be a direct reflection of the text, or how much can it be imagination and the child can look at that and they'll get it. And so really we're selecting illustrators and hoping that they're going to come up with that beautiful fine balance between the very literal, so that you are indeed illustrating this story and not going off to another planet, but also that it's an imaginative, wonderful approach, which especially in the case of the Yiddish lullaby, The Raisins and Almonds, she really did a nice job of the imagination and the real and bringing it all together. So we want imagination.
I'll tell you some of my thoughts as a spokesperson for a bunch of writers and illustrators. I'm also old school. I've been doing this a long time, given that my first book came out in 81, so I've seen a lot of changes. I'm now pitching stories to people who are the age of my children, which makes it always interesting. If I had the ear, if I was speaking at a conference for publishers, what I would say honestly is the relationship between an editor and an author is really personal. It's really traumatic. I had 4 editors either retire or change houses within 2 years. And you one day get a new editor, and it's like waking up with a new spouse. They look at you and go, "Don't worry, everything's fine." And like, "Who are you? You're cute, but who are you?" And the sensibilities are so important, and you have to completely trust implicitly your editor. You have to choose your battles as to what you really want to hold on to, what you're willing to change. I've learned to always say, "Let me sleep on it and try it," and often I'm surprised that I like it, or I go back to maybe I don't. But as someone who travels around the world and speaks to people, I read my stories a lot, which are on my iPad, and I can project them. I know when the air is sucked out of a room and the story hasn't worked. On the same breath, I also know when something resonates. The first time I read Oops to a group, I had goosebumps. It was like they got it. And so to trust each other. So for publishers to go, you know, you're out in the field, how are these books going over? I mean, A Kiss of Death, to bring a book to an editor and go, "My grandchildren loved this story. My neighbor's cat loved it." It's like they don't care about that. But as someone who does go out and speak to large groups of kids a lot and teachers, I know when the story's working. So if I say, you know what, I'm really kind of feeling like this should be in the story, I'd love them to be open to sleeping on it as well. The other thing that I've really noticed as a change as a writer is it used to be, if you read Dear Genius, the book that was about Ursula Nordstrom, she was the godmother of children's books with Harper. Every wonderful Harper book was Ursula's editing. Times have changed. The idea that you can send a story to an editor and them say, you know, I love so much about this story, but there's a lot of things that need work. Do you want to play with me on this? Those days seem to be getting shorter and shorter, if not gone. I've had more books rejected with lovely letters. And I get it when a person's being polite, but instead of saying, you know, let's go back and forth, they don't have the time that they used to have. The amount of books that an editor's given to edit and publish a year has gotten increasingly more and more, and I feel it must be a very difficult job to be an editor at a publishing house now. But I miss the days when we could have a dialogue. I mean, I just got a rejection last week, and I wrote to my agent and said, do you think I could talk to them? And because there were so many things this editor liked. And I would normally never have asked. I would have just written. But it's a different protocol now. And I do wish that people could take a little more time to talk to the authors about what they're working on, plus the timetable that it takes if they get back to you at all. Because I mentor a lot of women who are writing, and they'll send books out and never hear. That is unconscionable to me. And it's unfortunate that people are so burdened that they don't have time. But we spend all of our time working on these stories, and to send it out and wait 6 months and not hear a thing is really difficult. So I would kind of wish that there would be some way to respond to authors and illustrators and have dialogues.
Mm-hmm.
They could be productive.
Yeah, points well taken.
It's my soapbox.
So you two have not yet worked together to create a book. So what ideas can we in this room come up with that might be a project that would work for both of you?
We'll dedicate it to you and take all the money.
So, and we have the microphone here. So if anybody has any thoughts, we'd love to get your input. While you're thinking, do you guys have any thoughts on something that might fit into both of your styles?
I would love to do a book with Barney. We just have to find the right one. But now that you're a little more focused, I think, on occasionally at least doing kind of Jewish-themed things, and you know that there is a market out there, I would love to do a book with you. Yeah, we'd have to think about that.
My father-in-law was a director of a temple, and we got married, and our daughter went to preschool at Beth Am and came home talking about Haman, and I said, is that a new boy in your class? At which point my wife said, you're not a Jew. And we decided I was a gastronomic Jew. I had no education in that, so I'm learning, as you said.
Yes. Is somebody raising their hand? Come on up.
Well, I was going to say holidays that are not typically written about would be great, like no more Hanukkah books or Passover books, but maybe Shavuot, something about the Ten Commandments. Tikkun Olam, we always need more Tikkun Olam and social justice, but with a little bit more Jewish context. And, Israel. Yeah, there's never enough Israel books that give a balanced picture, that portray daily life in Israel, something like that. Those are what I'd love to see.
Good suggestions. Thank you. Well, I'm just thinking in terms of, your very creative aspects. I watched a video of you doing a sort of a Beautiful Oops type of project with a class where you took things out of the garbage can and made a picture out of them, just to show that you think it's trash, but it doesn't have to be. It could still be useful.
Absolutely.
Which then kind of makes me think of the Joseph Had a Little Overcoat Jewish folk tale of that you don't give up something just because it's worn out. It might still find another use.
Yeah,
it could be repurposed. So along those lines, it could be, we have many, many retellings of Joseph Had a Little Overcoat. We don't necessarily need another one, but sort of along those same lines of the value of not just giving up on either material things or ideas seems like the kind of work that you do.
Absolutely.
And that you have a sense of humor, which I think is really important, that whimsy and humor I love about your books. So
Thank you. Can we do a board book for the counting book of the Ten Commandments?
yes.
I'm kidding.
Yes. Don't be kidding.
Really, the I think it's a older subject matter than a counting book, but maybe.
So we're going to have our Tikkun Olam segment, which if you're a regular listener, you know that we talk about ways to repair the world. But first, I'd like to have a little music. And Barney is a musician as well as an author-illustrator.
Oh, yeah, this is going to get interesting because I forgot my guitar and my glasses. So if I'm looking at you funny, that's why.
There you go.
All right, so I'm going to teach you a song. I really should have a Beautiful Oops song since I forgot a guitar, but never mind. The follow-up book to Oops was called A Little Bit of Oomph. And I always love saying the word oomph with kids and ask them if they know what it means and where it came from. And I read somewhere, probably online, that two people were picking up something heavy and went oomph. I don't think that's really where it came from, but I like the image. So the book, A Little Bit of Oomph, was pretty funky. It wasn't a great book. It was a great concept, but Wonder was hitting really big at that moment, and Raquel wasn't really around a lot, so it was missing a lot. And to try to hold up a tiny book when you're giving an assembly for 400 people doesn't go over well. So I always write songs to go with the books, and I wrote a song called A Little Bit of Oomph. GarageBand on the iPad, there's a guitar, unless anybody has one on them. So let's see if this is how loud is it going to be. That kind of works. All right, so the chorus goes, let's see, little bit of oomph, little. So can you do that? Little bit of oomph, 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 little bit of oomph. We're going to do this a cappella because this is kind of questionable. So, all right, so then that's the chorus. The verses you'll sing after me. They get a little squishy, sing whatever words you can fit in there. If they don't fit, just drop them out. So it's going to start off with, we can give a little. We can give a little. We can give a lot. We can give a lot. Want to make it special.
Want to make it special.
Give it everything you've got.
Give it everything you got.
It isn't always easy.
It isn't always easy.
Sometimes it's tough.
Sometimes it's tough.
Working like a dog.
Working like a dog.
Can be a little rough.
Can be a little rough.
Remember the cow.
Remember the cow.
Jumped over the moon.
Jumped over the moon.
It took a little bit of oomph.
Took a little bit of oomph.
To float like a balloon. To float
like a balloon.
A tiny little bird.
A tiny little bird.
Can learn to fly.
Can learn to fly.
A lumpy old potato.
A lumpy old potato.
Can be a French fry.
Can be a French fry.
Chorus goes, little bit of oomph. Little bit of little bit of oomph. A little bit of oomph. Little bit of oomph. All right, good. We know the story.
We know the story.
Tortoise and the hare.
Tortoise and the hare.
Tortoise had oomph.
Tortoise had oomph.
Won the race fair and square.
Won the race fair and square.
The big bad wolf.
The big bad wolf.
Had huff and puff tricks.
Had huff and puff tricks.
A plucky little pig.
A plucky little pig.
Built his house of bricks.
Built his house of bricks.
We can turn a doodle.
We can turn a doodle.
Into a work of art.
Into a work of art.
Nothing's gonna happen.
Nothing's gonna happen.
If you never start.
If you never start.
We used to crawl.
We used to crawl.
Now we walk.
Now we walk.
Used to say gaga.
Used to say gaga.
Now we talk.
Now we talk.
A little bit of oomph. A little bit of oomph. Little bit of oomph. Little big finish, little bit of oomph. Amazing.
Woo!
I'm not bringing my guitar anymore. It's so much easier. Think about the flying. I wouldn't have to check my suitcase. I'm not bringing my guitar. That's it.
Thank you. That was so much fun.
Thanks.
So let's go into our Tikkun Olam time. I'm going to ask each of you, Joni and Barney, but also I'm going to ask the audience to think about this too. What action would each of you like to invite us, here in the audience and the listeners at home, to take to help repair the world? Joni, go ahead.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about Books for Africa. I am the incoming president of Books for Africa. I've been involved with this organization for a number of years, and they are trying to end the book famine in Africa by sending donated books to the continent of Africa. We just had our 30th anniversary, and books as of this year have been distributed in every single country on the continent. So it's a huge thing. There's the website, booksforafrica.org. You can give money, you can give books, and you can just lend support. You can just like the website, and that would be a wonderful thing to do. So thank you, Heidi.
Thank you.
I have a little one that's not quite as global, but it is global in that I see it all over the world now. This is going to sound really basic, and it kind of is, but it's not as simple as it sounds. Talk to your children. Talk to your grandchildren. I see families at dinner at restaurants and their children are plugged into a phone, walking their children in strollers and they're on their earbuds, and in their cars where they're wearing headphones and watching movies while their parents are driving. The time I had with my children in the stroller, not that I fit, when I pushed them, I'm not that big, was magical. We made up songs, we looked at things, we listened to sounds, we told stories. The time in the carpool was a great time. They didn't have to make eye contact. You could talk about anything. In restaurants, to engage them. Even maybe you need 5 minutes to look at a phone, but it pains me to see this disconnect. And maybe this is the progress that evolution is bringing to us, that our people are now plugged into screens. But even if it's 5 minutes a day, maybe it's a digital Shabbat. It could be more than once a week. I wish it were daily. So that's my pet peeve and something I wish people would just do more of and pass it along.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If we had more time, I would take a moment for you to all turn to your neighbor and share a tikkun olam thought. I don't think we really have time for that, but keep it in mind and throughout the rest of the conference. It's a great topic of conversation as we're all here together. So I want to point out that there are listener surveys on the table at the back, and that also people who are listening to this podcast, there are surveys on bookoflifepodcast.com if you just go to the survey tab. So that would be very helpful to me in making the podcast the best it can possibly be. Thank you all so much for coming. And Joni and Barney, thank you for your suggestions for making the world a better place, and thank you for being on the podcast today.
Thank you.
Thanks to audience members Toby Harris, who took the mic to share her thoughts on books that Joni and Barney could create together, and Pat Givens for the action photo that now appears at bookoflifepodcast.com. And thanks for the positive feedback. While I was at the conference, I recorded a short bonus episode for you of myself and author Jonathan Auxier playing the game Super Fight. Tune in next time for that fun extra. Don't be a stranger. Say hi to Heidi at 561-206-2473 or bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com. Check out our Facebook page or our Facebook discussion group, Jewish Kidlit Mavens. We are occasionally on Twitter, too. There are lots of ways to support the show through Patreon and through donations to our home library, the Feldman Children's Library at Congregation B'nai Israel of Boca Raton, Florida. You can find links for all of that and more at bookoflifepodcast.com. Our background music is provided by the Freilach Makers Klezmer String Band. Thanks for listening, and happy reading.